Welcome to Future², the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future² brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick, digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future² is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future². Today I'll be speaking with Robert Kegan. He's a psychologist who teaches, researches, writes, and consults about adult development and professional development. He's co-founder of Minds at Work, a consulting group that works with senior leaders and teams in corporations, government, and non-profits. He's the William and Miriam Meehan Professor of Adult Learning and Professional Development at Harvard University, where he co-directs the Change Leadership Group. He's contributed many articles and books on psychological development and has published 7 books, including An Everyone Culture, Immunity to Change, Change Leadership, How the Way We Talk Can Change the Way We Work, and In Over Our Heads. He's co-authored several of these books with Lisa Lahey, who unfortunately couldn't join us on this podcast. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to bring to you Robert Kegan. Welcome to Future², Robert.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to be with you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. Before we kick on, you've got quite a decorated background, and some people may not know that you are, well, I'm not sure if this is self-proclaimed, but I'm keen to find out a little bit more. The unheralded inventor of the base average, which is obviously, for our Australian listeners, a more comprehensive way of gauging a baseball player's offensive contributions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I can't imagine that would be terribly interesting, Steve, to your Australian listeners. I don't even know if baseball is a big sport in Australia.
No, look, it's not, but I think it's still quite an interesting little anecdote.
Well, I just returned actually from watching the Boston Red Sox go down to defeat last night, so I actually have baseball on my mind. The base average is a way of an elegant and appropriately simple. I say appropriate because baseball is really a 19th century game. You kind of sit there, and a little bit like fishing, you basically just kind of enjoy the surroundings, and every once in a while something exciting occurs. But it's a way of assessing the baseball player's offensive contributions by taking account of the number of bases that they win, so to speak, for their team per at-bat. So it's a way, it has actually been published. It's one of my prouder publications in a baseball actuarial journal, and it has not been used by any professional team that I'm aware of. So it's a rather undistinguished career. But I was kind of pleased to get a letter some years ago from a Little League coach who told me that he read it and that he uses it with the kids because it's a way of showing the kids that there's lots of ways to make contributions. You don't have to just be a big home run hitter. You can even make outs that advance runners because that attains bases, and the statistic keeps track of all the ways they help the team get more bases. And the game is called baseball, after all, not bat ball.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense, and I love what you said.
Know more about it than you want.
No, that's more than enough. But it's funny you should say that it's a way that helps Little League ballers determine that, hey, I can contribute to this team in different ways. And I think that's a good segue into what we'll be talking about today, which is about company culture. And you recently released An Everyone Culture, which you co-wrote with Lisa Lahey, who unfortunately couldn't join us on this call. But And Everyone Culture is essentially all about becoming a deliberately developmental organization. It's your first book together with Lisa in 7 years, and the book explores transitioning from an organization where people are spending their time covering up their weaknesses, managing people's impressions of them, playing politics, and hiding insecurities, to one where the culture is safe and demanding enough that everyone comes out of hiding. Can you perhaps elaborate a bit more about how you came to explore this topic, Robert?
Absolutely. So, as I think you and I'm sure many of your listeners know, I've spent my life, professional life, studying the possibilities of our further unfolding beyond adolescence. I mean, when I started as a graduate student in the 1970s, if you studied developmental psychology, it literally meant that you studied infants, children, and adolescents. I mean, that was the period of the lifespan in which we thought development occurred. We pretty much yoked our notions of psychological development to physical development. And just as we tend not to get any taller than we reach in our 20s, we believed that that was kind of the end of the growing season, so to speak, for the mind or psychologically. Of course, people knew that you could get wiser as you grew older and had more experience, but that wisdom was attributed entirely to learning how to get more out of the same equipment, not about actual further evolution of the equipment itself. And so I've been studying the trajectory of development with my colleagues, and we then turned, and I credit my colleague of 30 years now, Lisa Lahey, with really instigating this, came to me, 30 years ago and said that, it's a good theory. Now, how are we going to actually make use of it? And we started turning toward the educator's question, what are the ways you can actually support development? And we created, over about 20 years, this immunity to change coaching approach, which has turned out to be very powerful and sort of humbling with respect to its influence. It's got much more traction than the base average, Steve.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
We then turned our attention to, okay, this is a powerful way of engaging a single individual, for example, in like executive coaching kinds of things, or even a small team. But we asked ourselves, if you so value developing the capabilities of your people, if as a leader of an organization you recognized, as most do, that you're only going to go as far as your people will take you, and so you wanted to create an organization that would be the world's most powerful incubator for supporting the ongoing development of your people.
Right.
What would your organization look like, if it were to actually take account of the science of adult development and neuroscience? And, that's what led us into really starting to look at organizations, ask ourselves, how well do they actually do in terms of truly developing their people?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it reminds me of moving from a fixed mindset essentially to a growth mindset. And I mean, would you say that changing the equipment is more important today than it's ever been before, given the world's moving so quickly, and we're entering a more uncertain environment where many of today's jobs may not exist in 5 or 10 years' time?
Exactly. And what we came to see was, even though most organizations say they care about people development and they do a lot, with and for their people, and I don't doubt, the sincerity of that, when you actually look at what they are doing, I have a picture now in my office of a 19th century surgical room, and you see 3 very, very conscientious and concerned surgeons, standing around the patient on the table. But one of the things you're struck by, having watched enough, medical television shows, is that not one of them is wearing a white lab coat. No one's wearing a mask. No one's wearing gloves. And, this has something to do with why, even when surgeons in the 19th century understood the particular surgical procedure, they were trying to enact and understood it correctly, they still had such high mortality rates from surgery because we didn't yet have a germ theory. We didn't yet understand anything about infection or sterility. And when we look at organizations today, given that we've spent our lives studying adult development, it kind of looks like, organizations that in not taking account of all of the science of adult development are basically trying to do the best they can, but, without a germ theory.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy there. And most of our audience are whether they're entrepreneurs or involved with corporate innovation, I think this topic is quite relevant. For example, on innovation, organizations usually host, say, brainstorming events. But the problem often with brainstorming events or workshops is that people are essentially scared to say something in case they come across as stupid or ignorant. However, as you'd probably appreciate, Robert, innovation thrives when many disparate ideas come together and are built upon over time by different people. Essentially, there are no bad ideas, and innovation by its nature is quite chaotic. How important is it that an organization becomes a deliberately developmental organization in order to support, that unbridled creativity and innovation?
Yeah, I think that the DDO, as we call it for short, since the deliberately developmental organization is quite a mouthful, is really the premier organization if you're interested in something like innovation or meeting adaptive challenges. I mean, what we did was, Steve, we had our kind of beginning picture of what a truly 21st century organization would look like if it were going to be a great incubator of development. And then we kind of cast around, admittedly within the U.S., we wanted to be able to study these organizations, and it wouldn't be too convenient to fly to Australia. I'm not saying that there aren't lots of DDOs elsewhere, but we confined ourselves to the U.S. We interviewed a number of companies, even very, kind of iconic and celebrated companies where the leaders even would say to us themselves, that's interesting what you're looking for, and that's about 20% of what we were able to do. We're really not a DDO. And we wanted to know, is this just some kind of a fantasy idea in the head of professors, or could we actually find organizations that actually were doing the sorts of things that we thought would be necessary to truly develop your people? And we found three organizations, and we studied the heck out of them. That's really what the whole book is based on. They were courageous and generous and let us into every nook and cranny of the company. And to go back to your question, I mean, one of the first things you see in these companies is that they create a climate for mistake making and error, and not worrying about having a bad idea. That is, it's almost as if you were to take the entrepreneur's mantra, that you need to fail fast, you need to fail frequently, and you need to fail forward. That is, learn from the failure and apply that mantra not just to your business model, but apply it to people development itself. What would you need to do to create a culture where instead of trying to always be at your best and to never fail and to never look stupid and so on, you create a culture where people are actually much more comfortable failing frequently, fast, and forward?
That's right. And I think Intuit is one such organization who I believe they have monthly events where they get up and basically celebrate people's smart failures. Obviously there is a difference between a smart failure and, for lack of a better word, a dumb failure, where we basically plow too much money into something over too long a period, but a small failure where you get the requisite learning you need and it doesn't cost that much money. And I think we definitely need to be encouraging that type of thing. And out of curiosity, Robert, you said you found three organizations. Is that out of a number of organizations that you spoke to? How long did it take you to find those organizations? I guess I'm curious to find out what the ratio was.
I don't really know if we can scientifically say what the ratio is. I can kind of tell you the facts that we have quite a number of friends. We serve a lot of organizations, and so we had quite a good Rolodex. We put the word out for what we were looking for. We got about 30 candidates of, really very interesting organizations. We don't name any of the ones we didn't choose for obvious reasons, but most of them, as we looked into them, very impressive in various respects. But of those 30, that we interviewed and explored, there were really only 3 that kind of, matched up to what we were looking for. But, I'm not a hard scientist, but I'm not so soft that I would say that you could conclude from that 10% of the companies, in the world are DDOs. I think it's a much, much tinier percentage because the sample that we were working from the start were companies that were already nominated by people as ones that they thought would possibly qualify.
Yeah. And keen to explore a little bit further on the 3 companies that you identified. I mean, are these companies that have a track record in innovation, in pushing the boundaries when it comes to new product development, or?
Yeah, and that turned out to be very, we were very happy to see that as we began to explore these companies, they were not only extraordinary, and we should probably get into some of their practices so your listeners can get more of a sense of that, but they were not only extraordinary in their people development, but they also turned out to be just damn good businesses by any conventional metric, which obviously was important to us because we didn't want people dismissing the work on the basis that, this is probably great for its employees, but they're not going to be around there much longer because you got lousy businesses and it's no way to run a business. In fact, all 3 of these companies are very, very distinctive within their sector. So the company that's probably best known to people is Bridgewater, the world's largest and most successful hedge fund. It's just had an extraordinary kind, of performance record. But, a second company is an e-commerce business called NextJump that I think it was Inc. magazine published an article on, the best company you've never heard of. They won the McKinsey Award for innovation. They're a tech company that has to live with an industry where you hire up these very bright young people from tech schools, and Charlie Kim, the CEO of NextJump, told us that they were getting recruiting offers, on almost every 2-3 weeks, and that the average turnover, in their industry is about 40%, which, if you just think about that, that's just, it's mind-boggling. If you think about the hidden and actual costs even of a single turnover, to be losing 40% of the people. And they have gotten, since they became a DDO, they have gotten their turnover, down to single digits. The third company, Decurion, is a portfolio of businesses. The one that's probably best known is their chain of movie theaters, high-end movie theaters, best place to go see a movie, ArcLight Theaters in the U.S. And they, too, are an industry leader. They have the highest gross per screen, in the movie theater business. So all 3 of the companies happily are not just doing something extraordinary for their people, but that it's a true mutual kind of thing. The organization is helping people to flourish, and the people thereby are helping the organizations to flourish.
Yeah, look, that's a couple of great points there I wanted to dig deeper on, Robert. Firstly, with NextJump bringing down their turnover rate from 40% down to single digits, it seems to align quite closely with a lot of thought leadership out there that says when you give people an opportunity to fail, to come out of their shell, to be creative, to innovate, it increases employee engagement and retention, particularly for emerging, well, not necessarily emerging anymore, but for Gen Y and I suppose your emerging Gen Z cohorts, they really want the opportunity to create, not just execute set procedure.
Absolutely true. And that is absolutely something, the first thing you notice kind of in these organizations, and we saw studies recently that showed that the top of the list, of millennials who somebody told me that by 2020 we'll make up the majority kind of the workforce, is we want more feedback. We want to know on a regular basis how well we are doing. And in these organizations, and I also consult to and serve, non-DDO organizations. Just got off the phone with a very senior executive of one of the largest banks in Eastern Europe. He told me that it has been 3 years since he got any true feedback on his own personal performance.
Wow.
And he didn't think it was all that unusual. I mean, he gets feedback on, how much he delivers and whether he meets his numbers. But in terms of a kind of feedback about personally the choices he's making, what his strengths are, what are the areas, that he could get stronger at, almost never happens. In the DDO, if you have 3 or more people, for example, in a meeting at Bridgewater, each person in the meeting has a company iPad that has all kinds of apps loaded into them, and one of them is this thing called the dot collector. You dial in a number, and it brings you to that particular meeting. It lists all the people who are in that meeting. For your handy-dandy reference, though you probably know it by now, it lists a whole host of qualities that I think anyone would consider desirable in people participating in a meeting. Were you a clear communicator? Were you a brave communicator? Did you come up with a good synthesis? Did you, push back and hold your ground? I mean, any of these kinds of things. And during the meeting, Steve, I don't mean just kind of at the end of every meeting, let's evaluate how it's going. If during the meeting, I'm in the meeting with you, and, I'm impressed by the way that you kind of stood up for yourself and, fought courageously, for a position that you were holding or something like that, I'll just, using this app, just indicate, there my admiration. I'll give you an 8 or a 9 or a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale with respect to a particular quality. I might even type in a sentence or a phrase. By the time the meeting's over, or even during the meeting, you can watch and observe, what people's reactions are. Similarly, I might give you a 3 if I feel like, your argument was completely illogical and didn't hang together. And when people hear about these kinds of things, a very common reaction is alarm, where basically people say, well, I guess I could understand the value of that, but I'd find it awfully uncomfortable. I'd find it pretty exhausting, and it would fill me with a lot of anxiety, frankly, to be getting so much feedback.
Yeah.
But that is, I'm not going to say these organizations are immediately easy to work in. We all have to kind of get beyond our ego and get over ourselves a little bit. But when people make the shift, and this is a profound shift, Steve, where they actually come to realize how much of their life, and especially how much of their work life, is a kind of performance, where they do feel like they're on stage, and that, you're going to get feedback. It's like getting a review, if you were an actor or the playwright, and you hold your breath, and the last thing you want to hear, is a kind of unfavorable review. That is the spirit, to go back to your distinction between, Carol Dweck's growth mindset and fixed mindset, that orientation, looking at work essentially as a performance, is going to, of course, make any of these suggestions that your listeners might be hearing sound very anxiety-provoking. And as long as people, even in a DDO, and it could take a year or a little longer, they find, for people to kind of get to the other side of this. But when they entering in this kind of performance orientation, wanting to do well, wanting to deserve to be hired, and so on, it can be a rough experience.
And I think in today's fast-moving environment, one needs to be growing perhaps more than ever before. And you touched on quite a few interesting points there. And the example you gave of the CEO in the Eastern European bank not receiving any negative feedback, It reminds me of a conversation I had recently with Dave Gray, who co-wrote the culture map with Alex Osterwalder, and he gave the story of a manager who, whenever somebody brought him bad news, he would basically bring out the hairdryer treatment and just completely scold them. And sure enough, slowly but surely, people stopped bringing him bad news, but that's not because there wasn't any to report. He wasn't self-aware enough to realize that, hey, I need to be encouraging this behavior because then I have a better view of the organization and then I can make better decisions. Would you say, and perhaps you can't say too much, but in this example, say with the Eastern European Bank, is that a reflection of the CEO, or is that a broader cultural thing where people don't want to, I suppose, provide negative feedback or constructive feedback to someone further up the food chain?
I think that that company is not a whole lot different than a lot of other companies that we could look at, where it's less a function of the current leader and more a function of this is the way we've always done business, and the successor leaders kind of take up their role, in that culture, and they continue to carry it on. I mean, one of the things I've been very impressed by in this work is just how incredibly powerful culture is, and just how it can be just so determining of the choices that people feel like they can make. But I wanted to just go back and just hope that I maybe be a little clearer for your listeners. I mean, what is the alternative to taking up work as a performance? And that alternative is to take up work as an opportunity for practice more than performance.
Right.
And this is the irony that a high-performance culture in the conventional business sense, or at least a highest-performing culture, may not actually be, at the psychological level, a performance culture at all, so much as it is a kind of coaching and practicing kind of culture. Once you take up the position that what you're doing at work is basically practicing and trying to get better. And I mean, I was so struck, like, at Bridgewater, I first interviewed a lot of the people who were working on the culture and who were in management positions. And I was not surprised, that they were so engaged with the culture itself. But, I said, look, you're a hedge fund, and, I want to talk to some of the people who are, doing the heart of the work. I mean, bankers, investment people, traders. I want to talk with them. And so the next day they set me up with a group of them, and I said at the very beginning, I'm really intrigued with your culture, and I want, eventually to talk with you about that and the way that, you interact with it. But, I mean, you're also in a particular business, and I wanted to talk with you guys because you are close to the heart of the business itself. I mean, trades and, the things that investors do. And they just looked at me like I had two heads, and they said, we're going to try to be nice, Bob, and just kind of chalk this up to the fact that you've just started researching us, but you couldn't ask a question like that if you actually understood how we operate. You want me to talk with you about how we think about investing and credit and valuing, macroeconomic indicators and so on, and then you want us to talk about the culture. That's impossible, which to me that was so intriguing. What they said is, look, and listen, imagine this coming from a banker, not from, a human potential expert. They would say, look, one of the things that's great about working here is I get up every day and I know very clearly what I'm working on, myself. I'm working on myself. There's no way that I do anything, whether it's, analyzing, some macroeconomic indicator, that I'm not also connected to, what I know is my weak side and certain tendencies that can get me in trouble. That's how pervasive the culture is. And once you recognize nobody's here to hurt you, you're going to hear tough stuff. We're going to look at your weaknesses. But isn't that what you would expect like a tennis coach to do? He's going to admire your forehand, and give you some chances to hit those forehands beautifully. But, if you're running around on your backhand, you're just not going to ever be a great tennis player. Yeah. And would you want that coach to just kind of conspire with you and ignore the fact that you can't hit that backhand? Or would you want to just keep working on that and working on that until it gets stronger. And once you take this practicing orientation, the feedback becomes truly like nourishment, as opposed to something that you clench your fists and hope you can kind of get through the torture.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting segue now. I mean, I basically, on practice v performance, organizational psychologists basically found that once basic needs have been met, giving people an opportunity to develop mastery, providing them with some autonomy, and I suppose giving them purpose ultimately motivates them above most extrinsic motivators. And I think further to that, the comment you just made about the tennis, the backhand and the forehand, but I think that's something that perhaps we lose once we move from childhood to adulthood. Kids are huge on video games, and gamification is a big thing today. But the whole concept of you've got 3 lives, you try to get past level 1, you fail, you lose all your 3 lives, but you know where you went wrong. You try again, and then you get to level 2, and slowly but surely you end up completing the game. And this whole concept of try, fail, learn, pick yourself up, keep moving forward. Somehow it's kind of beaten out of us as we go through the motions of growing up.
I think it's a really good point that you're making. And then if you especially couple that to the fact that we are learning that the story of development doesn't end on your last day of school, no matter how advanced your education has been, then we have to ask ourselves, this is like a bigger question than just about business, but thinking about the human species itself. And after all, we've got a lot to worry about with respect to how we're doing as a human species. You have to ask yourself, well, if the schools have been supporting development and we weren't too concerned about the fact that only happened, maybe for the first 25 years of your life, why should we worry about that? Because that's the growing period. There isn't any growing after those first 25 years anyway. Now that we know that is not true, that people can and need to keep growing and developing, through their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, we have to ask ourselves as a people, where are the institutions that are going to support that ongoing development? What happens when you turn to work itself and say, hey, not just for the benefit of individuals, but for the benefit of their organizations, work has to be a good school. It has to be a place where people will continue the developing that they were doing, in their quote-unquote real schools.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Bob. And I suppose I guess I want to jump back into practices. I mean, you mentioned one of the practices there around using an app to rate people or people's performance in a meeting. What are some of the other practices that stand out amongst these 3 organizations that you've identified?
Yeah, so like at Next Jump, and it's interesting, as readers will see, and I hope they will pick up this book and let us know what they think of it, the 3 companies are, in many ways, they're quite different. I mean, they have this common thread of kind of following the basic principles of a DDO, but they show you that there are lots and lots of different ways that you can do it. Next Jump kind of said, look, let's boil things down to 2 qualities. It's important that people have a kind of confidence in themselves, respect their own, views, but it's not good to be so confident that you basically think that you're always right and you always have the best idea. And let's call that for what it is, arrogance at the extreme. Similarly, it's good for people to be humble and, to look toward others and have doubts and questions. But it's not good for them to be so humble that they discredit, their own view, doubt themselves to the point of paralysis. And at its extreme, let's call that what it is, insecurity. And then they said, look, probably everyone leans a little bit in one direction or the other, and maybe more than a little. And the 2 leaders of Next Jump, for example, Megan Messenger and Charlie Kim, they will just come right out and tell you, in Charlie's case, that he leans in the direction of arrogance, and in Megan's case, in the direction of insecurity. And you can't spend 15 minutes with any person, Steve, in that entire company without their just kind of folding into the conversation, which direction they lean. So they'll talk to you about this initiative they're working on, and then they'll say, and I lean insecure, by the way. So, I'm working on that. That's their backhand. Everyone knows, what their backhand is. And then there are a set of practices. And in the book, we kind of say that it's, there's 3 features of a DDO. You have to think about the extraordinary nature of the challenges they provide, the extraordinary nature of the support they provide so you can meet those challenges. And then the third thing is the rich set of practices that enable these activities to just be woven in to a normal work day or work week. So there's like a little wallet-sized card that people carry around in NextJump. It gives you tips and suggestions for how to operate if you lean more in the direction of arrogance or insecurity. So like one of the first meetings we were in with NextJump, we gave our little introduction, what we were researching and so on, and we opened it up for questions, and this woman jumped right in and asked us a good question, and Charlie said, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I just want to, acknowledge, Denise. Denise leans insecure. Notice she's the first person to jump in and ask you a question. And that's because she's practicing her backhand right now, right here during the meeting. We know that people who lean insecure typically speak less and later in a meeting. And the opposite for the people who lean arrogant. And the way that the arrogant people are practicing is, they're doing everything they can to bite their lips and keep from jumping in, and here's Denise doing what she should be doing. Get your voice in early, ask your question early. Now, this is just a simple example of a very simple practice, costs nothing, easily integrated into all the natural rituals of work life, meetings, and so on. But when everybody knows what we're up to, it becomes tremendously powerful. The value just compounds.
Yeah, and I think that again comes back to fixed versus growth mindset, and some of the stuff you talked about earlier on the hedge fund managers and the bankers and people who essentially get out of bed every day and look forward to it because they're investing in themselves. I mean, this obviously aligns with their personal happiness, and essentially, I suppose the interpretation of contentment with one's work is moving away from one that's, I suppose, characterized by temporary experiences and possessions to one that's more about meaning, and talk about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he chronicles his experiences in the Holocaust, where he says that happiness must not be pursued, it must ensue out of everything you do. So would you say that organizations can generate quite a bit of benefit or happiness for their employees by creating a DDO?
Yeah, and this could be like a good note to end on, because I think you're raising a really important theme there, because when you look into happiness, and certainly, it's a part of the pursuit of the new incomes beyond just the material, as you say, that is going to be a feature of work life, I think, throughout this 21st century, that when you look into happiness, even the research into it and so on, you really see that there are almost 2 different traditions and definitions of happiness. And one definition is of happiness as a state of being a bit buzzed, a bit high, feeling excited. Boredom and pain are banished. It's the happiness tradition from the Greeks that comes out of hedonism. I don't mean in its necessarily derogatory sense. And some of the newer companies, today that are much celebrated, with 5-star chefs and keeping people happy and free days and volleyball courts and photo machines and all these kinds of things, which are wonderful. I mean, I have a lot to do with these organizations also, and I admire them. But that's only one half of the house of human happiness. There is another path to explore where happiness is regarded not just as a state, but as a kind of process. And this is happiness as it comes from Aristotle and the concept of eudaimonia, the happiness that comes from our further unfolding, from experiencing ourselves becoming the bigger, better version of ourselves that we were meant to be. And this form of happiness doesn't banish all pain. Sometimes the process of our own development is painful and uncomfortable, like labor pains, leading to new birth. And I think these organizations, these DDOs, which the book, An Everyone Culture, to get the name in one more time, it's really giving us a chance to drop down into explorations in the other half of human happiness, where happiness is not just about being buzzed, but where you're actually experiencing your own unfolding.
That's definitely a great way to wrap things up. But before we make a close on the podcast, there are 3 questions that I ask all of my guests, Robert. It's a bit of fun to wrap things up. And question number 1 would be, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
If I could work for any organization?
Yep, at any stage of their life cycle. So it could be Apple back in 1981 or Ford back in 1903.
Well, I don't know. This may seem a bit self-serving, but the honest answer, and I think this shouldn't come as a surprise. If I have spent with my colleagues, nearly 4 years now immersing myself in these kinds of organizations, that's, if I were a younger person, if I were going to be jumping into a place to work today, this is where I would go, either to a Decurion, a Next Jump, or a Bridgewater, as it is right now, or to a company that, whose leaders could be listening to me right now, who have an interest in the ideas, are not sure how far they'd want to take them, but who really want to explore what would their own version of being a DDO be. And, that would be a kind of company I would love to work in as well. And in terms of what role I'd like to have, I'd like to be kind of the, one of the chief culture officers, or somebody who's really looking after, how you tend to such a culture, or how you help an organization which has not had such a culture move in that direction.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And question number 2, Bob, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask? It's a tough one.
Yeah, let's see.
I always tell people to say the first thing that comes to mind, because if I was to ask you the same question tomorrow, you'd probably say someone completely different.
I think, I would like to talk to Einstein. And I would like to explore with him more. I'm not exactly sure the form of the question, but, Einstein said we're never going to solve the problems tomorrow with the same order of consciousness that we're using today to create these problems. And I suspect that Einstein, had something more than all of that, to tell us about the possible trajectories of, human evolution. And I'd like to, kind of ask him more about that.
About looking at problems through a different lens in order to solve them.
And what are the possible further orders of consciousness that human beings might be capable of?
It's definitely an interesting answer. And finally, Bob, lifestyle design. Do you have any rituals or routines that you partake in to stay on top of your game?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a lot easier. You either do or you don't, right? Yeah, absolutely. I have a number of basically meditative practices. They're mostly kind of homegrown, like a home brew. But there's a period practically every morning, like everybody says about their disciplines. If they don't do it, they can feel it, like they didn't brush their teeth that day. So practically every morning, there is a period of time where I completely empty myself of all thought, all intention, all desire, and I'm just, I don't really even know how to describe it, but I'm just being, okay? I'm not at work, I'm not trying to do anything, I'm not planning for anything. And that is a practice which I've been practicing, really since my 20s.
So that's a great practice, and essentially, I like what you've called it there, homebrew meditation. But essentially, for our audience, it's all about just not projecting into the future or into the past, and just being present and just being, like you've said.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of, which I hadn't made this connection before, so I thank you for it, is that Erik Erikson, who was an influence in my early studies, he said that the ideal state of the therapist sitting in front of the patient or client is to come to that person without memory or desire.
Correct.
In other words, if you're going to be fully present in that moment, it's not going to be colored by our prior history, through my memory, which takes me back sort of to the past.
Hello?
The future.
Yep. Sorry, you just cut out there, Robert.
So I don't know where I cut out, but this idea of kind of standing in relation to another without memory or desire, I think is a beautiful phrase, because it's suggesting, memory is the way I'm going to let the past basically shape this moment. Yeah. And desire is always about the future, what you're trying to bring about. And I'm not going to let this moment be shaped, by my desire, urgency, or effort, to make something happen tomorrow. If there's no memory and no desire, there's a certain way in which I'm completely in the present.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, bringing the past with you basically colors the way you see the world and colors the way you act, and it may not be supporting the best sort of outcomes. And, you mentioned Aristotle, and another great ancient Greek philosopher would be Seneca, one of the Stoic philosophers, and he makes this analogy of animals. Once they're, escaping a predator, once they've escaped, that's it. They're calm and they're present again. Whereas a human being, once he's escaped, he'll be thinking and wondering and basically not being present. So it's an interesting difference there between the animal kingdom and the humans, who essentially find it difficult to be present and always thinking about the past or the future.
Yeah, maybe we have a lot to learn from animals. That's one reason people keep pets, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you, Bob. You've been a great guest. Finally, where can people go to find out a little bit more about you and pick up a copy of the book?
Yeah, so they can certainly pick up the book through Amazon. Of course. And we would love for people to do that and write us a review of what you think. We're trying to get to 100 reviews on Amazon. I think we're about 68 at the moment. Then to learn more about me and about the DDO, I would recommend they're going to the website Way to Grow Inc. waytogrowinc.com. Way to Grow is the little business that we have created as a home for developing the ideas and practices related to the DDO. So waytogrowinc.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll include that in the show notes for our listeners. Thanks again, Robert. You've been a great guest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Cheers. Well, that's it for my chat with Robert Kegan on culture change and how some progressive companies around the world are supporting it. Coming up on Future², I'll be hosting our first live event on August 31 with very special guest Ash Moira, who created the Lean Canvas and wrote the influential book Running Lean. Ash will be joining me on campus before an audience, so if you happen to be in Melbourne, then you can pick up a ticket for just $10 at collectivecamp.us/events. As always, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, I'd love it if you take just 1 minute of your time to show some love by subscribing to and giving this podcast a 5-star rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. It would mean a hell of a lot to me and the team who helped put this together, and would also help us to continue bringing you the caliber of guests that we have to date. You can join the conversation on Facebook at facebook.com/Future² podcast, or subscribe to our mailing list at Future².xyz. If you've got any questions, feel free to tweet me at Steve Glaveski, send an email to steve@collectivecamp.us, or follow me on LinkedIn. As always, we've got a ton of blogs, podcasts, videos, webinars, online classes, and innovation resources, most of which are completely free and available for you to download today at www.collectivecamp.us. So make sure you check that out when you have a moment. Until next time, keep dreaming big. Future² out.